Hello friends, good afternoon and welcome to EduSat Live Lectures. Dear friends, today in Political Science we will be talking about nation, nationalism, state and nation state. To discuss this topic we have with us our subject expert Professor M.P. Singh. Professor M.P. Singh does not need an introduction. He is a luminary of Indian federalism. He was previously professor at Department of Political Science, University of Delhi. Presently, he is the chief editor of Indian Journal of Public Administration. Without further ado, I would like to welcome sir to our studios and request him to start the lecture. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, Amritpal. The subject of today's discussion has been much in debate in India as well as elsewhere in the world. The term nation is derived from the Latin word natio, which means being born or having been born. Now, Hindi equivalent of the term nation is Rashtra. In old Hindi, it was also called Jati, but that term is now associated with a smaller ethnic group, caste, and nationalism has a wider connotation. A nation is an impersonal, abstract, and overtly political term, and when people become conscious of unity of their interest, unity of some common interest, autonomy, and under certain circumstances, it may even lead to desire for self-determination. Now, nationalism is based on some markers. The markers of nationalism, it's based on certain markers, and the most important markers of nationalism are, language, religion, ethnicity, culture, history, territory, political and cultural institutions. These are all different markers of nationalism, different indicators of nationalism, and the important point that I want to make here is that neither one of these nor all of them together in certain cases have led to the emergence of nationalism. So it's a very complex phenomenon where, all these terms neither singly nor collectively suffice to make a nation under certain conditions. And therefore, it's a very complex phenomenon, and we have to interpret it hermeneutically rather than seek to explain it scientifically with precision of science or natural science. Now, the scrutiny of the real world makes us come to this conclusion. So, now, treat, what can be some ways out of this conundrum? There are some ways out of this conundrum. Like, for instance, we can try to treat nation as a phenomenon, of legal status. Like, for instance, citizenship can be the basis of nationalism, which can be operationally defined in terms of a passport, in terms of an Aadhaar card, in terms of inclusion in national register of a nation, voter's ID card in case of adult citizens. So that could be one way out of the conundrum of imprecise or vague connotation of nation. Nation has been defined as an imagined community by Benedict Anderson in a book of the same title, Imagined Community, and this is one of the most important recent addition to the literature on nationalism. Now, so nationalism can be defined in this way, where there is a lot of imprecision, but there are some concrete indicators which seek to explain the term in more concrete terms. But the important thing is that nationalism is basically a subjective status, a subjective feeling, and that subjectivity is difficult to capture. Now, another term that we want to discuss here is state, because nation state is a term that we often come across. The state is defined as a community of persons, more or less. A state is defined as an institution which is characterized by four elements basically: population, territory, government, and sovereignty. So a political community, operationalized in terms of existence of a population, existence of a certain territory where the people live, a formal government of the political community, and that government is endowed with or characterized with the feature of sovereignty, in the sense that there is no authority within the nation or beyond it that is higher to it or that is legally superior to it. So the two basic terms, state and nation, we have sought to define here. Now, nation state is the term which we will now try to define. Now, a state is called a nation state where the great majorities are conscious of a common nation and share the same culture. Thus, a nation state is one in which cultural boundaries coincide with the political boundaries. Now, so the political boundaries and cultural boundaries. So, the state is based on a cultural consciousness, a cultural identity, where these two features are found together. We find a nation state, or we call that entity a nation state. Now, let us try to historically locate these concepts. Now, historically, although states have existed since the ancient times, since ancient and medieval times, states have existed, but in modern history, historically, a state is supposed to be born as a result of the Treaty of Westphalia. The Treaty of Westphalia in Europe is in 1648 is supposed to be the beginning of what is now understood as a modern nation state. So the beginning of modern nation state, modern state can be traced back to the Treaty of Westphalia, 1648. It was signed after 30 years of religious wars. After 30 years of religious wars in Central Europe, the Treaty of Westphalia was signed, and the Treaty of Westphalia resulted in the independence of some political entities which were earlier part of the Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire, the emperor of this state, which was a wide geographical phenomenon, claimed to rule as a representative of the Pope in Rome. Now, the Treaty of Westphalia resulted in the independence of some European states who attained self-determination, attained sovereignty, and became independent of the Holy Roman Empire. So that is how the first modern state in European history is located, because the states earlier, before the Treaty of Westphalia, all the European states of that period were part of the Christian world, and the rulers of the states ruled on behalf of or under the overlordship of the Pope, the head of the Christian world. So, emergence of some states from the overlordship of the Pope, the head of the Christian world, the ecclesiastical head of the Christian world, is supposed to be the beginning of modern nation state. Now, I should make a clarification here that the sense of nationalism had begun with the Treaty of Westphalia, because Treaty of Westphalia and the war that preceded it was product of the Christian or Protestant Reformation. And therefore, Protestant Reformation resulted in the rise of a sense of incipient nationalism, and before that, the Latin language was the language of elite, and the entire ruling class operated through Latin, not in local languages of Europe, vernacular languages of Europe. Now, when Reformation, Protestant Reformation took place, the Protestant Reformation resulted in the rise of vernacular languages, where Latin was used throughout Europe. After Reformation, German, Italian, French, vernacular languages became the basis of official work, and that is how incipient nationalism started emerging in Europe. But mind you, this was incipient nationalism, not the full-blown ideology of nationalism. The full-blown ideology of nationalism was the product of the French Revolution, 1789. With the French Revolution, the idea of nation and state came to be fused, and a state became the symbol of nationalism, and monolingual European nation state came to be formed in this process. So French became the basis of the French nation state, English, Italian, French, and other local languages, vernacular languages, became the basis of European nationalism. Here it is important to remember that in history of Europe, on history of nation formation, history of formation of nation state, language has played a more important role than religion, and on this point, European history differs from history in our part of the world, South Asia, for example, where religion has also been an important contender for national identity, although language, even in Asian context, language is an important marker of nationalism. In fact, in case of India, language is a more important basis of feeling of regional nationalism, and in case of India, the linguistic reorganization of states is an important development in this regard. Now, so the Eurocentric view of a state, nation state came to be identified with a monolingual linguistic identity. English, French, German, Italian, Spanish, and so on and so forth. Now, when we look to other parts of the world, when we go beyond European history, we realize that this Eurocentric view of nationalism, or this Eurocentric view of nation state is not the only kind the world knows. In fact, by now, in the present age of globalization, by 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries, in fact, we have come to realize that monolingual model of nation state in Europe is not the general pattern all over the world. In fact, we will now refer to an important event which provided the basis of formation of a different kind of a state, not the nation state of European kind, but which may be called national state. Instead of nation state, we can call it national state. I will explain why. Let me first refer to the event that led to the emergence of a new kind of state. I am referring to the American War of Independence. The American War of Independence, 1775-1783, this was a rebellion of 13 British colonies in America, and their rebellion led to a war. And after the war, 13 colonies, American colonies, British colonies in America, became independent. And they first formed, because they had developed a sense of nationalism. In fact, it would be better to call it continentalism, because the American states were part of a continent. They were separately ruled from London. All the 13 British colonies were located in North America, particularly below the Canadian landmass. So they were ruled separately as colonies from London, but because they were part of one continent, they were geographically placed together. A sense of continental nationalism, if I may use the term, had developed. And mostly English was the language. French had some presence in America and Canada both, but English was the predominant language. So the common indicator, common marker of language, English, and common continental location in America below the Canadian landmass led to development of some nationalism, and the 13 independent states that emerged out of the British rule, they first assembled in a continental congress. They formed an organization, an assemblage, a meeting, continental congress, and the continental congress, an assemblage of all the 13 states, representatives of all the 13 states, led to formation of a confederal union. Confederal union, a union in which states are more powerful than the federal state, federal government, because all these 13 colonies were sovereign after British departure, and they had come together to form a union, and therefore in division of powers, the sovereign states kept more powers to themselves and delegated very limited power to the federal government. And under the Articles of Confederation, United States of America was formed, and it was under this constitution that America was initially ruled for less than a decade, but the experience of the independent rulers, independent government in America was that since the federal government was too weak, it became difficult to govern. It became difficult to continue the process of governance because the federal government was too weak. And therefore, the Continental Congress was followed by another assemblage of the representatives of all these states, and the next conference was held at Philadelphia. And the Philadelphia Convention, it was called Philadelphia Convention. At the Philadelphia Convention, the representatives of the 13 independent states now drafted a new constitution after discarding the Articles of Confederation, and the new constitution became more federal. Instead of making it confederal, where states were more powerful than the center, they now framed a federal constitution, not a confederal, federal constitution, in which the division of sovereignty was more equitable, and the states as well as the federal government got significant powers. And under a strengthened federal government, United States of America has been governed as a federation right from that date, 1787, when the present American Constitution was drafted at the Philadelphia Convention and promulgated, enforced since 1789. Now, this was a new kind of a state, very different from European states that we discussed earlier. European states, as you will recall, were monolingual states based on one language, one state, so to say, and the sovereignty of the government, sovereignty of the state was too much emphasized. If you try to study literature on sovereignty, on literature on a state, you find that the most significant definitions or theories of sovereignty have originated in Europe in post-French revolutionary period. In European context, sovereignty of the state, unified sovereignty of the state was greatly emphasized because European states were monolingual, unitary states mostly, and in unitary monolingual state, one language or one culture, sovereignty of the nation was greatly emphasized. Now, if you compare the United States of America with Europe, the Constitution of the United States of America with European constitutions, you find that there is a great difference between the two. In the United States, sovereignty was not concentrated in a unitary state. Sovereignty was divided between the federal government and the state governments. And the state governments were given significant powers under the Constitution. So, the American state, the new kind of state that came to be formed in America, significantly differed from European nation states. And American Constitution was based on the principle of separation of powers, the principle of federal division of powers. The makers of the American Constitution borrowed the concept of separation of powers between parliament, executive, and judiciary from European political theorists, John Locke, Montesquieu, and others. And with this theory of separation of powers, they combined the theory of federal division of power. This federal division of power theory was invented by makers of the American Constitution. This was not borrowed from Europe, because no one could have borrowed on federalism from Europe, where unitary state, sovereign unitary states predominated. And therefore, there was not much to borrow from Europe in terms of federal theory. Federal theory was a creation of American statesmen, and the American statesmen who were represented in the Philadelphia Convention, among them, 3 of them wrote articles on the American Constitution to propagate the cause of the Constitution and to promote the ratification of the Constitution by the federating states. Because after the Constitution was formalized, drafted and enacted, it was referred to, after the Constitution was enacted by the Philadelphia Convention, it was referred to federating states for ratification. And in order to facilitate the ratification of the Constitution, 3 makers of the American Constitution wrote articles in a New York newspaper, and these articles were compiled in a book that has become most important theoretical text on federalism. The book is called The Federalist. The title of the book is Federalist. Articles, 85 articles compiled in that book, were written by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. All 3 of them had participated in making of the Constitution, and they explained the nature of the Constitution in this book, Philadelphia Convention. This part of the lecture now concludes, and we will resume it later. Thank you. the previous session, we were discussing The Federalist, authored by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, and we were contrasting the European model of nation-state with a new kind of national state that emerged in America. It was based on the principle of federalism. The American Constitution is also marked by presidential federalism. The principle of presidential government and federal government are combined in the American Constitution. Federalism, as I already mentioned, is based on the principle of division of powers between the federal government and regional governments, and presidential form of government is based on the theory of separation of powers, a very strict theory of separation of powers between the Congress, American Parliament, the presidency, and the Supreme Court of America. So, the contrast between the European states, the model category, a statistical term model, the general category, the most numerous category of European states happen to be monolingual nation states, one language, one state, so to say. The American system is federal as well as presidential. American, in contrast to America, European nations are also generally parliamentary. So, presidential federalism is the basic feature of American state that I am trying to differentiate from the European model of nation state. But let me bring to your notice here existence of some federal states in Europe as well. As I had earlier pointed out, that in Europe, sovereign nation state, unitary sovereign nation state had become the model category, the most numerous category of states on the European continent. But there were also at least some states in Europe that were also federal. I will discuss Switzerland, for example. Switzerland is a small European state which is presidential federal like America. But there is some difference between American Constitution and the Swiss Constitution. In America, the president is a single person office, whereas in Switzerland, the presidency is a collegial executive, a collective office consisting of 7 presidents. So, presidency is collegial in Switzerland. Swiss Federation is also different from American Federation in the sense that there is a strong institution of direct democracy in Switzerland. So, Swiss example is not a typical European example of unitary nation state. Switzerland is federal as well as presidential, much like America. So, and America is basically English speaking. America is English speaking, but Switzerland has 3 linguistic communities, and 3 linguistic communities joined hands and created a federal government in the year 1848. Swiss Federation is also very old. Since 1848, Switzerland has been a federal composite national state, not a nation state like France, but a national state. There is need to differentiate between nation state and national state. Sociologist T.K. Ullman has emphasized, has made this distinction between nation state and national state. A nation state is based on the European model of one ethnic identity, one nation state, like monolingual nation states. Switzerland is different in the sense that it's a federal union of three linguistic communities: German, French, and Romance. German, French, and Romance, these are the three linguistic communities who have combined and formed a federal union in Switzerland. So, whereas France and other European states give us the archetypical nation state, America and Switzerland give us the examples of federal national state, unitary nation state based on one culture, one nation, and national federal state, a composite union of diverse geographical entities which were initially sovereign in America, or a union of culturally diverse communities like Switzerland, consisting of the German, French, and Romance speaking communities. Now, so we have so far pointed out that we have to understand the phenomenon of nation, nationalism, and state in the context of comparative history, and a Eurocentric view leads us to a very distorted notion of nationalism and nation state. And much of the world today is moving towards federalism. Federalism, if anything, appears to be the growing form of government in the world. A recent book on comparative politics has pointed out that in more recent constitutions of the world, wherever new constitutions have been made in recent decades, two institutions are very common, very popular, and these are federalism and judicial review. Federalism and judicial review, these two characteristics are becoming very popular in the new world, in the contemporary world. And it seems to me that in coming years and coming decades, federalism is going to be even more popular than it is today. Today, 25 countries of the world are federal, and 40% of the population of the world lives under federal governments. So, it's important to keep in mind, while we are seeking to understand the phenomenon of nation, nationalism, nation state, and federal state, and to understand why there is need to emphasize that the European unitary nation states are not the only model. In fact, more characteristic model in the world today is national state and federal state. In course of this expansion of our vision, expansion of our vision of analysis beyond Europe, we have gone to America, we have gone back to Europe and located at least a few European nations that are federal, different from the classical archetype nation state. And in Europe, federal constitutions are becoming more popular. Federalism is increasingly being incorporated in some states. Belgium has adopted a federal constitution. Spain is trying to federalize its unitary system. Now, in course of expansion of our vision beyond Europe, let us look at a new category of nations, or national states that have emerged. I am referring to the Commonwealth Federations of Canada and Australia. Canada adopted a federal constitution in 1867, and Canada was earlier called bicultural or binational because Canadian Federation in 1867 was created by two linguistic communities, the English and the French. As you might know, there are 11 provinces in Canada. 10 are English speaking and 1 is French speaking. The French speaking province of Quebec has a French majority, and in the rest of Canada there is English majority. Because of the presence of two national communities, English and French, the English and the French, Canada adopted federalism, and Canada did not want to adopt presidential form of government prevalent next door in America. Canada has been more influenced by the British tradition, and because of the crown connection, you know, Canada never had a war or rebellion against the British crown as America had. So Canadians wanted to stick to the British tradition of parliamentarism, but they also had the need to depart from unitary state model prevalent in Europe, because they had in Canada the presence of two major national communities, the English and the French, and the presence of two different linguistic communities demanded a departure from unitary state, unitary nationalism, and therefore they adopted a bicultural nationalism, which since 1971 officially is now called multiculturalism. Since 1971, Canada has adopted a policy, a state policy, which is called multiculturalism. Multiculturalism has become official policy of Canada, and many countries have adopted this ideology, whether they call it composite nationalism as in India, whether they call it federal nationalism as in America and other federal countries, whether they call it national state rather than nation state. So the point I am trying to make is that these two Commonwealth countries, Canada in 1867 and Australia in 1901, adopted parliamentary federal constitutions. Australia is different from Canada in the sense that predominantly Australians are predominantly Christian, Protestant Christians, predominantly English speaking, and the kind of bicultural or multicultural background that necessitated the adoption of federal constitution or federal nationalism in Canada is not there in Australia. But still Australia adopted federalism because there was a long tradition of separate colonies ruled from London but not linked on the Australian continent, and gradually a sense of nationalism developed in Australia as well, and Canada and Australia adopted parliamentary federalism and a model of nationalism which is multicultural, which is federal and national state model, and India also followed suit. India also followed this illustrious example, and India became the first country in the Afro-Asian world to adopt a parliamentary federal constitution. Canada is the first parliamentary federal country in the world, and India is the first parliamentary federal country in the Afro-Asian world. And the point I'm trying to make is that all these countries, Canada, Australia, and India, in fact, we can also include Malaysia, which has also adopted parliamentary federalism since 1957. These are multicultural nations, and some of these are vast in geographical expanse, and therefore their model of nationalism and their model of state differ significantly from the classical archetype European unitary nation states produced in the wake of the French Revolution and Napoleonic Wars. Now, at this point, we can try to offer a classification of nationalism. Nationalism is a phenomenon which needs to be gone into more thoroughly, because nationalism is a very powerful force, and there have been ideologies that have tried to stamp out nationalism, at least in its extreme form. But nationalism has survived international communism. Marx and Engels did not believe in nationalism. They believed in international communism. Workers of all countries unite. Not only workers of one nation, but workers of all countries unite. That was their slogan. And they aimed at creating, international communism. But we have seen, in the wake of the disintegration of the Soviet Union, in the wake of the Chinese shift to capitalism, we have seen that nationalism is a very powerful force, and international communism could not eradicate it, could not stamp it out, and globalization of capitalism, after the Cold War and after the disintegration of the Soviet Union, the process of capitalist globalization became a very powerful international force, and it again became a standard argument that the nation state is becoming extinct. Nation state or nationalism has become obsolete, and globalization, universal globalization of culture would create a universal culture, and nationalism would fade out. But that is not happening. Already we are witnessing the phenomenon of British exit from the European Union, Brexit as it is called in a composite term. Brexit is a departure or a reversal of the process of regional integration or European integration, and the Trump phenomenon in the United States of America, the emergence of the election of Donald Trump as the president in the previous elections just held just a few months back, show that capitalist globalization would also not be able to erase nationalism as a force. Nationalism may become a dangerous force, as it was demonstrated in fascism and Nazism in Italy and Germany, but in a moderate form, in a moderate way, nationalism can be a liberating force. It can be a progressive force. It has led to liberation of the colonies into self-determining independent nations. Nationalism has also led to the fight for emancipation of the poor in various countries. In federal countries, the Commonwealth that is created is a device of using the Commonwealth of nations for richer provinces as well as poorer provinces, and together they can produce a more prosperous nation through device of federalism, which is just and equitable to all. So classification of nationalism is something that I would be discussing now. There are many classifications, a lot of classification in various writings you will find, like for instance Hans Kohn in his book Nationalism has made a distinction between Eastern and Western nationalism. And in Hans Kohn's book, by Eastern, the model of Eastern nationalism was Spain, and model of Western nationalism was the United Kingdom. So this classification is also there, but this classification has some problems because it leads to cultural and geographical stereotyping and some condescending characterization of nationalism of some countries, and therefore a more defensible classification of nationalism can be made. And looking for this kind of classification of nationalism, we find two major categories that are becoming more common, more widely acceptable. One is ethnic nationalism and the other is civic nationalism. Ethnic nationalism and civic nationalism, these two kinds of nationalism can be located in various parts of the world. Ethnic nationalism is based on some cultural identity predominantly. The basis of ethnic nationalism is predominantly some cultural identity, language, religion, and so on. And the basis of civic nationalism is some kind of secular identification with the nation. Secular identification with the nation in terms of multiculturalism, a multicultural communion, a federal unity, a federal union, and a kind of nationalism that thrives on secular symbols of nationalism like the national flag, the constitution, democratic institutions, judicial review, and constitutional governance, which is based or which is defined, understood more in civic terms than in ethnic terms. Of course, it is quite common that a concrete case of nationalism would present varying proportions of civic nationalism as well as ethnic nationalism. Now, Anthony D. Smith, a British political scientist, a British political theorist, has tried to bridge the gap between ethnic nationalism and civic nationalism. Ethnic nationalism is also called primordial nationalism. Civic nationalism is also called, constructivist or modernist notion of nationalism. And the most common, most widely accepted definition of nationalism today is offered in a book by, in a book by Benedict Anderson, in which he defines nationalism as nationalism is defined as an imagined community. Nationalism is not something that is given by birth. That his argument is very convincing, that nations that we find in the world, they are based on constructed identities, constructed national identities. It is not given in birth, it is not given by birth, it is imagined by the communities who create the nation.
Dear friends, due to paucity of time, we have to stop our lecture here. With that note, we would like to thank Professor Singh for coming to our show and delivering this wonderful lecture. And thank you, dear friends, for watching our show. Stay tuned and keep watching. Thank you.